Welcome back, everyone. This is going to be our hands-on demonstration in which we're going to demonstrate setting up a point-to-site connection on Azure. Quick note before we jump into it, just to set the appropriate scope, since there are three different authentication methods, we are not going to demonstrate each of those three in detail, nor does the exam require that much detail as well. However, I did want to demonstrate specifically an Azure AD authentication method, which will provide a good demonstration of working with the Azure VPN client. Additionally, the separate lab attached to this section demonstrates using certificate-based authentication, so we will at least have exposure to two of the more popular authentication methods. For this particular demonstration, since we are using the Azure AD authentication method, you will unfortunately not be able to follow along in the Azure Playground because this specific demonstration requires access to the full tenant, and it also requires having global admin access to your Azure AD tenant as well. If you do have access to your own Azure organization in which you are a global administrator, feel free to follow along in there. Otherwise, just go ahead and watch along. You're not going to be really quizzed in detail on the steps that we are taking in this demonstration. So what we're going to do in this particular demo, we're going to start with a single virtual network and also a separate Windows 10 virtual machine that is not part of that virtual network. Side note, if you are following along and you have your own Windows machine, you can certainly use your own local Windows machine to connect. I'm just using a virtual machine because I don't have a local Windows machine to connect with. In this demonstration, our VPN gateway is already up and running, so we can go ahead and jump straight into the point-to-site configuration aspects. Once we are in our Azure environment, these are going to be the big picture steps we are going to take to set up Azure AD authentication. We're going to start by enabling Azure AD authentication, which is done by installing the Azure VPN application to our Azure AD Enterprise Applications list. After that, we're going to configure our VPN gateway for point-to-site connectivity using Azure AD as an authentication method, and once again, we will be using the OpenVPN tunnel type, and during the configuration process, we will set it up for Azure AD. Once our gateway is set up, we will then go to our virtual machine side or our client side to enable point-to-site connectivity, in which we are going to install the Azure VPN client, download a point-to-site configuration file. We will then import that configuration into our Azure VPN client application, and then put in our Azure AD username and password, and if everything is done correctly, we'll then be able to privately connect to our virtual network. Let's go ahead and jump over to our Azure environment and take a look. Okay, we are now in our Azure environment, and I am in the VPN gateway settings that I've already created in advance, and I also have another tab open up top, which takes us to our Azure AD applications list, which we are going to populate with the Azure AD application here in just a moment. So going back to our big picture steps, the first step is to install the Azure VPN client application to our Azure Active Directory Enterprise Applications list, which I am in right now. Now, the installation process is a little bit interesting in that Microsoft assumes that you have a direct link to the application, which I am going to copy and paste into a separate tab. That said, Microsoft's documentation also lists out all of the steps, which include all the relevant links we are going to work with. And just a heads up, I will include a link to that documentation for this lesson for your own reference. So, starting with step 1, I need to add the Azure VPN application to our Enterprise Applications list. To do so, I will open up a new tab, paste in the link I've copied from off screen, and assuming I am a global administrator, which I am, I'll go ahead and select my account, and then be prompted to add the Azure VPN application to my Azure AD organization. Looks good here. Let's go ahead and click on Accept. This will complete in just a moment. Then it takes me just right back to our Azure portal. I'm going to go ahead and close our extra tab. And then after refreshing my screen, we now have Azure VPN added to our Enterprise Applications list. Very good. Next up, after adding the Azure VPN application, is to configure our VPN gateway for point-to-site connectivity. To do so, let's go back to our other tab, which will be our point-to-site VPN gateway, collapse our blade, click on point-to-site configuration, and I can go ahead and make a new configuration from here, and I'll click on Configure Now. First step is to assign our client address pool. For this demonstration, I'm going to use the address pool of 10.9.0.0/24, which should not conflict with any of my other address ranges. Our tunnel type for this demo is going to be OpenVPN. Notice we also have SSTP, IKE version 2, and also combos of two different protocols if we do want to mix and match for different compatibility reasons. And also underneath our authentication type options, we have Azure Certificate, Radius Authentication, and Azure Active Directory, which I am going to select. Next, we need to configure a tenant ID, audience ID, and issuer ID, which will match up with our Active Directory environment and also our Azure VPN Enterprise application. I'm going to go ahead and pause here for a second, copy and paste in the values, and then briefly explain them before we save our configuration. Okay, I have copied and pasted in my values from off screen. The tenant and issuer info use the directory ID of my Azure Active Directory environment, which I do have blurred out for security reasons. However, the unblurred out part of the tenant will always start with https login.microsoftonline.com/ and then your own directory ID. And the issuer in the same manner will be sts.windows.net, then your directory ID. With the issuer configuration, you do have to have a trailing slash at the end or else it won't work. And then finally, we have our audience, which is going to refer to the ID of the Azure VPN application earlier installed to our enterprise applications. And this audience ID is the same universally, regardless of your own directory ID. Okay, everything else looks good. Let's go ahead and click on Save. Now, in my experience, this takes a few minutes to save this configuration. I will pause and come back when it is done. Okay, and after a couple minutes of waiting, our configuration is saved. If I refresh my screen, I'll go ahead and click on Reload since the configuration is saved. What I should get access to now is this option to download the VPN client. This is going to download the VPN client configuration, which I'm going to import into the Azure VPN client application on my Windows 10 machine, which will then enable our Windows 10 machine to connect over VPN to our virtual network. Let's go ahead and do that now. I'll go ahead and click on Download VPN Client, and that will take just a moment to complete. And now that our VPN client configuration is downloaded, I'm now going to transfer that over to our Windows 10 machine and then pick up from there. Okay, we are on our Windows 10 machine. We are now going to connect, and I've already transferred our configuration files to our Windows 10 machine as well. If we go into our Downloads directory, we have our P2S VPN Gateway configuration. And if we go to our Azure VPN folder, we have an XML file here, which is going to populate the relevant fields in our VPN client. Now, for demonstration's sake, I've already downloaded and installed the Azure VPN client application from the Microsoft Store just so we can go ahead and jump on into it. However, if you have not already done so, if you go to the Microsoft Store, which I already have open here, search for the Azure VPN client application, download it, install it, and then go ahead and open it up, which is where we are going to pick up. So I already have my Azure VPN client application up and open, although we currently do not have any profiles added to it. Let's go ahead and do that now. To import a profile, I will click on our plus sign in the bottom left, and then we need to go ahead and click on Import and browse to our VPN client configuration file. In this case, it's already taken me to that directory. However, if you wanted to go to it from the top, we go to Downloads, Gateway folder, Azure VPN, and select Azure VPN config here. Once we click on Open, it's going to automatically populate our domain-specific information so we can go ahead and connect. Our connection name is going to be Hub VNet. Our VPN server correlates with our VPN gateway. And we have other information automatically populated, such as our certificate information, the server secret, which is automatically generated for us. That was populated by the configuration file. And we have our relevant Azure Active Directory configuration information as well, which matches up with the tenant, audience, and issuer fields that we filled out in our previous configuration on the Azure side. Also notice that the VPN client can authenticate using Azure Active Directory, and it can also use certificate-based authentication and username and password as well. In this case, we are going to go with Azure Active Directory. Everything else is good. Let's go ahead and click on Save. So we now have our configuration loaded. Let's now go ahead and do the last step and connect to our VPN client using Azure AD authentication. I'll go ahead and click on Connect, and then get a prompt to go ahead and sign in with my Microsoft credentials, which I'm going to go ahead and do now. Username is Matthew at controlaltsuites.com. I'm going to copy and paste my password in from off screen. And because I follow best practices, I have two-factor authentication set up for my account. I'm going to go ahead and approve a request on my Microsoft Authenticator app on my smartphone, which I am doing off screen now. And let me in. Last step, I'll go ahead and uncheck this box, sign into this app only, and now I am officially connected over point-to-site VPN on my Windows 10 environment. Two things I want to point out real quick. If we look at our connection properties, our VPN address that you see here correlates with the client address pool we set up in our point-to-site configuration. And our routes include our client address pool and also include the route to the hub network, which is the virtual network that is hosting our point-to-site connection. So last thing I want to do is go ahead and test out this point-to-site connection and make sure it actually works. As part of our pre-set up process, I created a virtual machine inside of our hub virtual network that I'm now going to attempt to ping over a private IP connection. Let's go ahead and go to command prompt and test it out. And since I already configured this in advance, I'm going to ping that virtual machine's address of 10.0.1.4. And if it is successful, we are now getting a response back, which means we are now able to exchange private network traffic with our Azure virtual network from our Windows 10 machine over point-to-site VPN. Just to make sure this wasn't a fluke, I'm going to go ahead and disconnect our VPN session. And then once it is disconnected, we'll go back into our command prompt. Go ahead and ping our same machine again, and this time it will not be successful because that VPN connection no longer exists. Very good. At this point, we've demonstrated the process of how to configure point-to-site VPN to authenticate using Azure AD. Let's go ahead and review our key takeaways before we move on. In this demonstration, we demonstrated the process of creating a point-to-site VPN connection specifically using the Azure AD authentication method. Once again, I want to note this is one of only 3 methods available, and from an exam perspective, there wasn't really anything in this demonstration you need to memorize as far as exam details, but I do think it was a good demonstration of point-to-site VPN in action. Now, as far as what authentication is best, well, as usual, the answer is always it depends. In this case, the best method, quote unquote, is wholly dependent on what your specific environment needs. That's going to go ahead and wrap up this lesson. Let's go ahead and move on to the next one.